I'm going to quickly talk about data and what that currently tells us about how Newcastle, Geelong and Wollongong are travelling through these turbulent economic times. So there were four areas I was going to briefly touch on today. The first was just a bit of a background to the work I do, so you understand the context to what I'm talking about. The second thing I wanted to do was just look historically quickly, because the historical performance of the gateway cities has been very, very important. And a bit of a spoiler alert here, they have performed very well relative to the 101 other cities across Australia that we examine. The second thing I want to do is move from the historical to the current and look at some of these emerging indicators to see how the different cities are coping with COVID and what the impacts have been. And then finally, I want to actually look forward into the recovery phase of what hopefully soon to be entering recovery phase, and just mine some of the data we use in a bit more detail to pass on a couple of insights around infrastructure and some other aspects of what that recovery could look like. So let me just quickly get my presentation up. So in terms of that first section of just some of the background to the research we've done, at Polis Partners, we've started tracking the performance of 101 cities and towns across Australia. And we try and do this in what we think is a pretty simple, meaningful, consistent and timely fashion. It's simple because we use two key lenses. The first lens is economic growth and the second is inclusive growth. So economic growth captures many of the traditional measures that people are comfortable with and we'll see reported in the media on a day-to-day basis. And that includes things like business growth and employment, construction pipeline and population growth. On the inclusive side of the equation, we have things like unemployment rates and also welfare dependency. And the key to having inclusive growth there is we want to understand how economic growth is actually translating in a location to more opportunities for the local population. And it's this aspect around inclusive growth that we think makes the approach quite meaningful and also quite unique, because it's not all about economic growth for the sake of economic growth, which is often the mantra. We want to see this actually. We want to see any economic growth actually translating into opportunities for the local population. We try to keep all the analysis and everything I'm going to chat about today, it's all very consistent between the cities and towns across Australia. And the way that we've managed to do that is not trying to compare Newcastle with Sydney, because any kid in Year 6 will tell you there's a multitude of reasons why you can't necessarily compare one town to the other. But what we actually do is compare each city and town to its historical average. So we want to understand, is Newcastle, is Geelong, is Wollongong over or underperforming historical averages in a lot of these key areas. And the towns and the cities and the gateway cities that I mentioned that are performing strongly, they're performing strongly relative to their historical growth. So that's a very important point to note. And finally, this is as timely. We try to make this timely. So we update this twice a year. We use government data. There's always lags in government data, but it's as close to sort of near time or real time as we can get with these official sources. So that gives you a bit of a background to some of the work that's encapsulated in our report, the City Report. If I now duck down into the overall results of what we've seen recently, and this was where things stood at the end of 2019. I'll draw everyone's attention to the top right-hand quadrant, because in that top right-hand quadrant, you have towns, cities, and smaller regions that are growing. They're growing in an inclusive manner, and they're also growing in an economic sense. So that top right quadrant is really where you want to be. And you can see there that Geelong, Wollongong, Newcastle have all performed really quite strongly in this respect. They've all been leading the pack. And this led to, as Will mentioned, these have sort of been dubbed the Goldilocks Cities, along with places like Ballarat and some of the areas around the Sunshine Coast. These are the sort of places that are not too big, they're not too small. There's just the right amount of opportunities for jobs. There's industry diversity. There's the amenity and attractions that come with the larger towns, but you're not getting the crowds and the prices and the traffic that you're getting with many of the capital city counterparts. So a very important group of cities, and one that is playing out in terms of the data in quite a with quite a strong story. And remember, when we're talking about how they're performing, this is all performance relative to their historical averages. So to get to the next level of detail and actually understand exactly how well some of the gateway cities did, I've got a bit of a snapshot of some of the results up here. So you've got the overall ranking of each of the cities across Australia there in the first column. We've got how it then ranked on the economic criteria, and then finally how it ranked on the inclusive growth criteria. And as I flagged at the start, all of the gateway cities made the top 10, so top 10 out of 101 cities and towns across Australia. So this meant that they're currently significantly outperforming their historical trajectories or historical performance, and they're doing that in a manner that is a lot more than any other cities and towns. So we've got Geelong there, came second overall. The key characteristics and the thing to highlight about Geelong there was the strong performance both on the economic growth and the inclusive growth. So that was actually quite unique, scoring so well on both, but it really shows that there is a nexus between the growth that Geelong has seen in things like population, business growth, and the like, that is actually translating into meaningful drops in welfare dependency and some of those other inclusive growth measures. In terms of Newcastle, it was ranked 4th overall, and it was the top New South Wales city. Its results were slightly skewed towards economic growth performance. Some of this was driven by the Maitland Hospital investment, because when we look at Newcastle, we look at Newcastle and Maitland as the region. We also saw strong growth in the number of jobs and also the number of businesses in the locality to lay some really quite solid foundations. And when you look at Wollongong, which came 8th overall and was the second New South Wales city, you see quite a similar story playing out, in that it was a more of an economic growth story rather than inclusive growth story. But in the case of Wollongong, you also had quite a number of people coming off welfare payments, which helped their score there. So this is where things ended up at the end of 2019, and of course that is a big caveat, because this is all then pre-COVID. But I think that is still very, very important. It's important for a couple of reasons, because it highlights the trajectory that many cities and towns were on prior to the turbulence that we've currently seen. One of the things about all this data is you actually start to see some very individual nuances and unique identities coming through. And these trajectories and identities are very important when these turbulent times start, because they come to resilience and they come to how well a location is going to be able to rebound or recover. So in a sense, the reason I've spent a bit of time talking about the historical, although it seems an absolute age ago now, is because this essentially forms a bit of a pre-COVID baseline of which to understand location strengths or weaknesses prior to the current economic turbulence, but also then to measure what is working and what is not working in terms of recovery, to make sure that as we come through the end of 2020, into 2021, into 2022, we are actually starting to see meaningful improvements, both from an economic perspective, but probably more importantly, that inclusive growth perspective, that people in these locations are still getting the opportunities and still getting the opportunity to get back on their feet. So this brings me to my second point then, which the Lord Mayor has already touched on, and it looks at some of the current impacts of COVID-19 on these cities. And the way I've done this is by looking at unemployment rates. So this, of course, is one of the measures that we examine in the city report. And coming into COVID, all of the cities had very, very good unemployment rates. So all below 5%, actually down towards sort of the historical low levels for all three cities, Newcastle, Wollongong and Geelong. In Newcastle, you had approximately, this is in just sort of prior to COVID, you had approximately 13,000 people looking for work. And in Geelong and Wollongong, you had about 6,000 people in both locations looking for work. What I've then tried to do is use the latest JobKeeper data, so June.JobKeeper data put out by ATO and Treasury, to understand what COVID has actually meant for the local unemployment rates. And as you can see here, they've ticked up markedly. So in the case of Wollongong, we've had the greatest increase. So the unemployment rates jumped up to over 11% from around 4.8%. So What this means is in addition to those 6,000 people that were already looking for work prior to COVID, what we've seen is around another 8,000 people that within the Wollongong area that are now accessing JobKeeper claims. Newcastle unemployment rate has jumped up to sort of to the 9 to 10% range, with around 11,000 people on JobKeeper, and Geelong has just over 5,000 people on JobKeeper. So you can see there quite a stark jump, as one would expect, with a shock, both a health, social, and economic shock of this magnitude. The couple of caveats that I just draw to your attention here, which I think are interesting to ponder, is first, this actually probably underestimates the true impact of COVID-related unemployment. So, as the Lord Mayor pointed out, there are pockets within the community which will be much more adversely affected, such as the youth or such as certain skilled workers. But this JobKeeper data is also based on the location of a head office. So what this data is really saying is that there were 8,000 job seeker claims in, for example, in let's say Newcastle. There were 8,000 claims that were linked to head offices in the Newcastle region. This means that if someone was working for Qantas but lived in Newcastle, their JobKeeper claim would actually be counted in Sydney, because that is where the head office is. So there is reason to believe there's actually probably a bit of an undercount of unemployment by using this JobKeeper information to look at the gateway cities, whereas in the capital cities like Sydney and Melbourne, you've probably got a slight overestimation of the unemployment rate if you were to use this method to calculate it. The second important caveat is this is June. So this is prior to the second lockdown in Victoria, which will of course affect the results there for Geelong. So as we see successive data release, we'll be able to delve into that in a bit more detail. The final point I'd make here is that using this methodology, the unemployment rate across Australia is currently around 12.5% to 13%. So despite the caveats there around just how this is counted and changes that we see, all of the cities have actually fallen below that national level of 12.5% to 13% current unemployment rate. So I won't dwell on the current any further, but I wanted actually to finish off by just looking to the future, and particularly the role that infrastructure may play in the recovery. I think all levels of government and private sector as well has flagged the importance of infrastructure investment in this recovery. So what I've done here is just quickly again dig into the data in a bit more detail to understand what historic infrastructure spend per capita has been across different areas. And so I've done it on a per capita basis in a way to try and just normalize or make the infrastructure spend comparable between not only cities with 10,000 people, but places like gateway cities and also then of course the capital cities. And so what you see here are probably three implications or three things I'd draw your attention to. First, at the bottom there, we have the gateway cities. So that's roughly $1,500 spent on infrastructure investment per person in these locations. The second point though is the two lines above are Sydney and Melbourne, and at first blush you'd probably expect the infrastructure spend per capita here to be slightly lower than areas like the gateway cities and also regional and rural areas, because you have more people, so you should be getting economies of scale. There's more people to defray the costs around. So it's interesting in the last, especially those last 4 years, just the additional investment that's gone into to the capital cities compared to say the gateway cities. One rationale for this could be that these figures pick up both public and private sector investment. So if the gap between the lines of gateway cities and the Sydney and Melbourne there is to do with the private sector investment and the greater private sector investment that these capital cities will usually achieve, then it also just underscores the importance of this private sector investment in also stimulating the recovery going forward. If it's just the government sector story, then again, it's important to understand how government infrastructure spending, and I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone on the line the importance of this, how infrastructure spending is actually being distributed around Australia and whether that is actually matching both the population densities, the population locations, and the population needs. There's a huge infrastructure pipeline going forward. There was prior to COVID, and it's got even bigger now. So making sure that infrastructure and the right amount of infrastructure investment and the right type of infrastructure investment is coming into the regions is going to be critical. So look, that brings me to the end of a very quick romp through some of the data and some of the insights that we're seeing in the cities report at the moment. Again, to recap, historically the gateway cities have been performing very strongly, and that has given them strong momentum coming into the current turbulence. We have seen unemployment spike. We are waiting on more data to understand and further understand exactly what the impacts are at each location. But when you start looking to the future, there are key things like infrastructure, investment, and how that is actually playing out in these locations, which I think is going to be pretty pivotal for not just the recovery of the gateway cities, but for Australia more generally.